The dress was the color of a full moon. Bonnie had spent 3 weeks sewing every stitch with silk thread her mother had kept folded inside a cedar chest, a chest that smelled of dried lavender, and memories from a time when their family still carried a name worth speaking in the northern packs. The thread was too fine for fingers used to rough work, and her fingertips had bled more than once as she bent over the fabric by candlelight, working with the kind of concentration that borders on prayer. But the result was undeniable. The dress fell in soft layers from the fitted waist to the floor, with silver embroidery along the bodice shaped like intertwining oak branches. It was a subtle nod to the Caldwell pack's heraldry, the pack of the man who had promised to choose her. Cedric Caldwell had promised. Not with formal words spoken before witnesses, that was true. But he had promised in the way men promise when they do not wish to be held accountable, with glances that lasted too long, with the hand that had rested over hers during the solstice feast, with the whisper against her ear on a rainy night that said, "You will be mine, Bonnie, when the time comes." She had kept those words the way one keeps embers, carefully, away from wind, certain they would eventually become fire. She had built an entire hope on top of them, brick by brick, over the course of 2 years, and the time had come. The great pack gathering occurred only once every 3 years, when the clans of the kingdom assembled at Veldrath Castle to celebrate alliances, renew oaths, and above all, for eligible alphas to declare their choices before all assembled witnesses. It was the most significant event in the life of an unbonded she-wolf. It was the moment when fate was decided publicly, beneath a ceiling of gray stone and torches burning in iron brackets along the great hall's walls. Bonnie entered through the side corridor, not the main entrance. She knew her place. Daughter of a beta who had died without a pack, and a woman who had been cast aside by her own clan after her husband's death. Bonnie had no noble blood, no lands, no name that opened doors. What she had was the moon-colored dress, the amber eyes she had inherited from her mother, and Cedric Caldwell's promise kept inside her chest like a coal. The hall was full. Hundreds of wolves from every pack in the kingdom filled the long tables of dark oak. The scent was a dense mixture. Red wine spilled over stone, roasted meat, wood burning in the fireplaces at both ends of the hall, and the unmistakable smell of so many wolves in a single enclosed space, something that recalled lightning before a storm, heavy and charged. The torches cast dancing shadows over the banners hanging from the walls, each one bearing a different pack's symbol, and the murmur of overlapping conversations filled the air like the sound of an underground river. Bonnie searched for Cedric with her eyes. She found him near the center of the hall, close to the main table, tall and dark-haired with green eyes, wearing a cobalt blue mantle with the golden border of the Caldwell pack. He was handsome in the way that handsome people sometimes are, with a beauty that deceived, that made you believe there was kindness underneath because the surface shone so brightly. He saw her. For a moment, just one moment, his green eyes met hers across the crowded hall. And then he looked away, too quickly, and turned back to the man beside him, as though she were simply another figure in the packed room. Bonnie drew a slow breath. He is occupied. It is an important night. He will call for her when the time comes. She found Petra near one of the stone columns. Petra was her only true friend, a young woman with copper hair and freckles scattered across her nose, who had grown up in the same poor village as Bonnie, the daughter of a blacksmith who served the Wren pack. She was small, sharp, and had the most precise tongue in the northern reaches of the kingdom. "You look beautiful," Petra said. And the way she said it was not flattery. It was genuine astonishment. She touched the hem of the dress with 2 fingers. "Your mother would have wept." "Do not make me weep now," Bonnie murmured, because she felt her throat tighten. "Is he here?" "He is." Petra glanced toward the main table and frowned in the particular way Bonnie knew well, the frown she wore when she wanted to say something is wrong, but knew Bonnie was not ready to hear it. "Bonnie." "Petra." "I only want you to be prepared." "I am." She was not. The choosing ceremony began when Lord Veldrath, an old beta with curved shoulders who served as the castle's host, struck the stone floor 3 times with his wooden staff and called for silence. Conversations died in waves across the hall until only the crackling of flames remained. One by one, eligible alphas were called to the center of the hall to declare their intentions. Bonnie paid attention only at the edges. There was a tension growing inside her. A wire pulled taut, and she held her wine cup without drinking, her knuckles pale against the metal. Then Cedric's name was called. He walked to the center with that posture that wealthy-born alphas carry, that way of occupying space as though it belongs to them by birthright. Bonnie straightened. Beside her, Petra held her breath. Cedric Aldrich Caldwell, Lord Veldrath announced, declares his choice before the assembled packs. Cedric raised his head. And then he looked, not toward Bonnie, but toward the opposite side of the hall, where the Ashford family sat. I declare my intention to bond with Seraphine Ashford, firstborn daughter of Alpha Conrad Ashford, in honorable alliance between the Caldwell and Ashford clans. The hall responded with murmurs of approval. It was a powerful alliance. It made sense. Everyone understood. Everyone except Bonnie. The wire snapped. She did not fall. She did not cry out. She did not spill her cup. She simply went completely still for several seconds, like someone who has taken a blow to the chest and has not yet understood that they are falling. She felt the warmth of the hall become suddenly suffocating, the smell of wine and meat and wolf scent turning her stomach, the torches flickering, or perhaps it was her own vision that flickered. Petra put her hand on Bonnie's arm. Bonnie. I am fine. She was not. But the word fine was an armor she had learned to wear far too early in life, so she put it on now, teeth pressed together and chin lifted, and she told Petra she needed air and would return shortly, and she walked toward the hall's side doors with controlled steps that she prayed appeared natural, the steps of someone leaving by choice and not by flight, because she would not give a single person in that hall the satisfaction of watching her come undone. She reached the corridor, then the stone staircase, then the outer courtyard, where the night air struck her face like cold water, and she stopped, closed her eyes, and simply breathed. The rear courtyard of Veldrath was rarely visited at night. A stone fountain occupied its center, water still running even in the cold. And beyond the low wall lay the edge of the dense forest that surrounded the castle like a dark green rampart beneath the full moon. The moon was enormous that night, round and low in the sky, pouring silver light over the courtyard stones and over Bonnie's dress, which now felt like a cruel joke she had sewn herself. She walked to the fountain. She placed her hands on its cold stone edge. And then, because she was alone, because the night was deep, and the moon had no tongue with which to speak, she let the armor fall. The tears came without warning, silent at first, then with a trembling in her shoulders she could not contain. It was not only about Cedric. She understood in that moment, staring at her fractured reflection in the water's surface. It was about the silk thread that had bled her fingers. It was about her mother's cedar chest. It was about 2 years of hope built on sand. It was about being nobody's daughter in a world where the name you carried was the only key that opened doors. You were a fool, Bonnie, she said to her reflection, her voice rough. You always knew he was a coward. You knew. The moon watched from above, enormous and unmoved. She did not hear the footsteps. She did not hear the breathing. She did not notice at any moment that there was someone standing in the shadow of the stone arch that led into the courtyard, no more than 12 paces behind her. A tall man in a dark mantle with no visible insignia, who had left the hall for reasons of his own, and had stopped when he found her there, and who now stood completely still, listening to every word she spoke to the moon and the cold water. The man did not move. Because her scent had reached him like something without a name yet, something that stopped thought halfway through. and the dark eyes beneath his hood fixed on the figure with honey-colored hair falling over her shoulders, the silver dress, the shoulders trembling faintly in the night cold, and something inside him, something very old and very quiet, recognized this woman crying alone under the moon in a way he could not immediately explain. Then she lifted her face to the sky and said, "To no one. I will not wait for anyone ever again." And he, in the shadow, heard everything. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Bonnie stood at the fountain's edge with her hands still pressed against the cold stone, her eyes fixed on the sky, unaware that she was not alone. The moon poured its light over the courtyard in silence. The distant sounds of the hall, laughter, music beginning somewhere deep inside the castle, the clink of goblets, reached them like echoes from another world. The man in the shadow did not announce himself. He knew he should. He knew the longer he remained silent, the more the moment crossed a line that etiquette, even the rough etiquette of pack gatherings, would not excuse. But something held him exactly where he was, one shoulder resting against the stone arch, arms crossed loosely over his chest, watching. He had come outside because the hall had become unbearable in the specific way that large gatherings always became unbearable for him after a certain hour. Too many scents competing. Too many voices angling for his attention. Too many alphas performing strength for an audience instead of simply possessing it. He had needed cold air and silence, and Veldrath's rear courtyard had offered both on every previous visit. He had not expected to find a woman in a silver dress weeping alone at the fountain. He had not expected that scent. It had reached him the moment he stepped beneath the arch, and it had stopped him the way a sound stops you when you cannot immediately identify its source. Completely. Instinctively. With every other thought suddenly suspended. It was something warm beneath the cold night air, like cedar and wildflower, and something underneath both of those that had no name in any language he knew. Something that seemed to reach past every layer of composure he had built over 30 years, and touch something he had largely stopped believing was still there. He had told himself he would simply wait for her to leave. Then she had spoken to her own reflection, and the words had made something in his chest contract in a way he did not entirely welcome. You always knew he was a coward. You knew. He had watched the Caldwell Declaration from across the hall. He had noticed the woman in the silver dress not because he had been looking for her, but because the moment Cedric Caldwell's eyes had found hers and slid away, something in that small, deliberate cruelty had drawn his attention to where it landed. He had seen her go still. He had seen the exact moment the armor went up. He had watched her leave the hall with steps so carefully controlled they told him everything about how much effort that control was costing her. And then he had followed, without fully deciding to. Now she wiped her face with the back of her hand, a quick, almost angry gesture, as though the tears had offended her by appearing. She straightened her shoulders. She looked at the moon for another long moment with those amber eyes that caught the light in a way that was difficult to look away from. Then she turned around. She saw him immediately. The sound she made was not quite a gasp, more a sharp intake of breath, and she stepped back against the fountain's edge, one hand flying to her chest. "Who is there?" she demanded, and her voice was steadier than he expected, given that she had been crying 30 seconds ago. He stepped out of the shadow. He did not move toward her. He simply moved far enough forward that the moonlight reached him, revealing the dark mantle, the height, the face that was angular and unhurried, with dark eyes that carried the particular quality of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous presence in any given room, and having made a certain peace with that fact long ago. He said nothing immediately. Bonnie stared at him. He watched her take him in, watched her eyes move across his face, his bearing, the absence of pack insignia on his mantle, and he watched the moment she became uncertain, because she could not place him, and she clearly knew she should be able to. "You were standing there," she said. It was not a question. Her jaw tightened. "How long?" "Long enough," he said. His voice was low, not soft, Exactly, but controlled in the way that very little effort was required to keep it that way. The color that rose in her face was not purely embarrassment. There was anger in it too, which he found he respected considerably more than he would have respected pure embarrassment. That was... She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. You had no right to stand there in silence while I... You are correct, he said simply. She blinked. She had clearly prepared for a defense, and the absence of one left her momentarily without direction. I should have made my presence known, he continued with the same even tone. I did not. That was discourteous, and I will not pretend otherwise. Bonnie looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not fully read, which was unusual. Then she lifted her chin slightly, and he saw the armor go back up. Not all the way, but enough. Then I will pretend I said none of it, she said. You may pretend whatever you find useful, he replied. I will not repeat what I heard. Something shifted in her expression at that. Not trust. It was far too early for trust, but perhaps the beginning of the decision not to be immediately afraid of him. She turned slightly to the side, arms crossing over her chest in a way that was self-protective rather than confrontational, and looked out toward the forest beyond the low wall. You are not from any pack I recognize, she said. You wear no colors. No. That is unusual for a gathering such as this. It is. She glanced at him sideways, and there was something sharp in that look, a kind of assessment that most people did not bother to aim at him because most people were too busy performing deference. You are going to make me ask directly, aren't you? She said. It was not entirely a question. I find direct questions tend to receive more honest answers, he said. A breath that might have been the beginning of a reluctant laugh escaped her before she caught it. She pressed her lips together again. Who are you? She asked. He studied her for a moment. The silver dress. The embroidered oak branches on the bodice that she had clearly made herself. He could see the slight imperfections that spoke of hours of careful amateur work, and those imperfections made the dress more remarkable than any commissioned garment would have been. The red at the rims of her eyes that the moonlight made visible. The way she was standing, spine straight, shoulders back, feet planted, as though the ground beneath her belonged to her as much as to anyone else, despite everything that had just happened inside that hall. Orion, he said. He gave no title, no pack name, no clan. Bonnie waited, clearly expecting more. When more did not come, she looked at him with an expression that suggested she found the omission either arrogant or deliberate, and had not yet decided which. Bonnie, she replied, matching his brevity with a precision that felt like a small, quiet act of defiance. I know, he said. Her eyes sharpened immediately. You know my name. I heard it used inside, he said, which was true, though not entirely complete. She studied him with those amber eyes, and he let her, because there was very little in that courtyard that was going to harm him, and because he found he did not mind being looked at carefully by her. Why are you out here? Orion with no pack colors, she asked. The choosing ceremony is not yet finished. It holds little interest for me tonight. A gathering of every alpha in the kingdom holds little interest for you. The gathering does, he said. The ceremony does not. She was quiet for a moment. Because you have no one to choose, she said, and it was not mockery. It was the flat statement of someone who had learned to speak plainly when formality felt like too much effort. Because I have already seen enough for tonight, he replied. The wind moved through the courtyard, carrying the scent of the forest and the distant smoke from the hall's chimneys, and it lifted the hem of her silver dress for a moment and carried her scent to him again. Stronger now, and he kept his expression exactly where it was with the discipline of long practice. You should go back inside, she said after a moment. And the way she said it made clear she was not asking him to leave for her sake, but giving him a practical observation. People will notice your absence. People always notice my absence, he agreed. It has never required me to remain. She looked at him again with that sideways assessment. You are a strange man, she said. So I have been told. This time the almost laugh reached her eyes before she caught it, and it changed her face completely for a fraction of a second, and he filed that away without entirely meaning to. The doors to the inner corridor opened behind them. 2 figures stepped into the courtyard, and Bonnie turned at the sound. One of them was Petra, her copper hair unmistakable, scanning the space with an expression of genuine alarm that shifted to visible relief the moment she spotted Bonnie. The second figure was not Petra's companion. It was a tall man with a broad build and a scar that ran from the left temple to the jaw, wearing a deep burgundy mantle with the crest of the Draveth Pack, one of the most powerful warrior clans in the eastern reaches. His name was Garrett, and he was the Draveth Alpha's second. And he was looking not at Bonnie, but at Orion, with an expression that mixed surprise with something approaching urgency. "My lord," Garrett said quietly. Bonnie went very still. "My lord." She turned her head slowly and looked at Orion again, and this time, the look was entirely different from every look that had come before it. This time, she was reassembling everything, every word, every silence, every small omission, with new information running underneath all of it, like a current that changed the temperature of the water. Orion met her gaze. He did not look away, and he did not explain. He did not need to, because she was already understanding, and he could see it moving across her face in real time, the recognition, the recalculation, and underneath both of those, something that was not fear, but was adjacent to it, something wide-eyed and very still. "Orion," she said, and his name in her mouth sounded different now, careful in a new way. He inclined his head. "We will speak again," he said. Not a question. She said nothing, but she did not look away. The name settled over the courtyard like the first snow of winter, quiet, inevitable, changing the shape of everything it touched. Bonnie stood at the fountain's edge and did not move as Garrett crossed the courtyard to Orion's side and bent his head to speak in a low voice, words she could not hear, words that were clearly not meant for her. Petra reached her in the same moment, arriving at her elbow with wide eyes and a hand that gripped Bonnie's arm with the quiet desperation of someone who had just understood something important. "Bonnie," Petra breathed, barely above a whisper. "Do you know who that is?" "I am beginning to understand," Bonnie murmured back. "That is the AlphaKing." The words landed with a weight that was difficult to describe. Not loud, not dramatic, just heavy, the way truth is heavy when it arrives after the fact, and you realize you have already been standing in the middle of it, without knowing. Orion, the AlphaKing, ruler of all 7 territories, commander of the High Pack Council. The man before whom every Alpha in that hall tonight, including Cedric Caldwell, including Lord Veldrath himself, bowed their heads. The man whose name was spoken with a particular kind of gravity that other names were not. The kind of gravity that came not from fear alone, but from something that had been proven over and over, in ways that left no room for argument. He had been standing 12 paces behind her in the dark. He had heard everything. Bonnie felt a slow heat crawl up the back of her neck that had nothing to do with the cold night air. Orion finished listening to Garrett, gave a single nod, and then looked back across the courtyard at her. The moonlight fell across his face with complete indifference to the effect it created, and the effect it created was considerable. He was not handsome in the decorative way that Cedric was handsome. He was something older than that, something that had more to do with the way he occupied space, the absolute absence of performance in every line of his posture, the dark eyes that observed everything and volunteered nothing. He crossed the courtyard toward her. Garrett remained where he was. Petra made a small sound beside Bonnie that might have been a suppressed impulse to curtsy and flee simultaneously. "I owe you a more complete introduction," Orion said when he reached her, and there was something in his voice that might have been, in a man less contained, the beginning of an apology. "You owe me nothing," Bonnie said, because it was true, and because she needed something solid to stand on, and her own words were the only ground available. "Nevertheless," he said. She looked up at him. He was taller than she had registered in the shadow of the arch, and standing this close, the quality of stillness he carried was even more pronounced. The stillness of something that did not need to move to make its presence known. "You are the Alpha King," she said plainly. "I am. And you were standing in the shadow of that arch, listening to a woman talk to a fountain, and you chose not to announce yourself." Something moved at the very corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The suggestion that a smile was a thing that existed somewhere in his range of possible expressions. "I have explained my discourtesy already," he said. "You explained it once," she said. "It becomes more discourteous the longer I think about it." This time the almost smile was less almost. "That is fair," he said. Petra made another small sound. Bonnie ignored it. She was aware, with a part of her mind that was running very quietly beneath the conversation, that she was speaking to the Alpha King of the 7 territories the way she might speak to a man who had borrowed her market stall without asking. She was aware that this was either very brave or very unwise, and possibly both. She was also aware that she had spent the last hour having her dignity systematically dismantled inside that hall, and she had very little patience left for adjusting her behavior to accommodate the comfort of powerful men. "Why did you follow me out here?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I needed air," he said. "You were already here. And then you stayed. And then I stayed. Why?" He looked at her for a moment, and the dark eyes were very direct. "Because you said something worth hearing," he said. She waited, because she could tell he was not finished. "You said you would not wait for anyone ever again," he continued with the same even, unhurried tone. "I found that I wanted to know if you meant it." The words were so simple and so unexpected that Bonnie had no immediate response prepared, which was a rare enough experience that it momentarily silenced her entirely. "That is a strange thing for a king to find interesting," she said at last. "Perhaps," he agreed. "I have found that honesty is rare enough to be interesting regardless of where it appears." From somewhere inside the castle, a horn sounded twice, the signal that the choosing ceremony had concluded, and the feast was formally beginning. The sound carried through the stone walls and out into the cold night, and it pulled Bonnie's thoughts briefly back to the hall, to the Ashford table, to Seraphine with her good family name and her appropriate bloodline, to Cedric's green eyes sliding away from hers as though she were a stranger. She breathed in slowly through her nose. The Alpha King was still watching her. "You should return to the feast," she said, echoing what she had told him before. "Your absence will be more than noticed." "Garrett will manage it," he said, with a calm that suggested Garrett had been managing such things for some time. "The lords inside will want your attention." "The lords inside have had my attention for 4 hours," he said. "They will survive a brief interruption." Bonnie looked at him steadily. "What is it that you want, my lord?" she asked, and the title came out with a precision that was neither subservient nor disrespectful, simply accurate, the way she might label a jar in a pantry. He studied her for a moment with those unhurried dark eyes. "To ask you something," he said. "Then ask." "The dress," he said, and his gaze moved briefly to the silver embroidery at her bodice, and then back to her face. "You made it yourself." It was not phrased as a question, but it was one. "I did," she said, keeping her voice level. "For tonight, for the choosing." "Yes, for Caldwell." The name landed between them without ceremony. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "He is a fool," Orion said. The words were completely without heat, stated with the flat certainty of someone reporting observable fact, and the Ashford alliance will cost him more than he understands yet. Bonnie blinked. "You know him?" "I know his father," Orion said. "And I know the Ashford clan's debts, which are considerable, and which Caldwell will inherit the moment that bond is formalized." He paused. He chose badly, in more than one direction tonight. The last sentence was said with the same even tone as everything else, and yet it was different, and she heard the difference. And the heat that had been at the back of her neck moved somewhere less easy to ignore. "You do not need to say that," she said quietly. "I am aware," he replied. "I said it because it is true." The wind moved through the courtyard again, and this time it carried something new on it, voices from the inner corridor growing louder, and then the door opened again, and 3 men stepped out into the night air, and these were not servants or minor lords. Bonnie recognized 2 of them immediately, because their faces appeared on the mounted banners inside the great hall. Lord Cassian of the Vorn Pack, broad-shouldered and dark-skinned with close-cropped hair and a gold earring in his left ear, who was known as the most decorated warrior commander in the Western Reaches. And beside him, Eldrick Vane, the youngest son of the Northern High Council, lean and sharp-featured with pale hair and an expression of permanent dry amusement. The 3rd man she did not know, but he was large even by Alpha standards, and moved with a quietness that did not match his size. All 3 of them stopped when they saw Orion. Then their eyes moved to Bonnie. Cassian's expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but was clearly the precursor to one. Eldrick Vane's pale eyes moved between Bonnie and Orion with the swift calculation of someone assembling a picture very quickly and finding it more interesting than expected. The large 3rd man simply looked at her with a steadiness that was impossible to read. "We wondered where you had gone," Cassian said to Orion, with a tone that suggested he had not wondered at all, and had in fact come looking deliberately. "Now you know," Orion replied. Cassian's almost smile completed itself. He turned to Bonnie with a courtesy that was completely genuine, which surprised her. "My lady," he said, with an inclination of his head. "Cassian of Vorn. I do not believe we have been introduced." "Bonnie," she said. No family name, no pack name. Just Bonnie, the same way Orion had given her just Orion, and she was obscurely glad to have the precedent. "Bonnie," Cassian repeated, as though testing the weight of it. "You were inside earlier. Silver dress, difficult not to notice." "Cassian," Orion said, and the single word carried an entire conversation's worth of redirection. Cassian raised both hands briefly, the gesture of a man who was innocent of everything and wished to make that clear. Eldrick Vane had not spoken yet. He was still looking at Bonnie with those pale, quick eyes, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lighter than she expected. "You are the one Caldwell passed over," he said, with the bluntness of someone who had decided long ago that tact was largely inefficient. The words were not cruel. They were simply accurate. But they landed in the open night air, and there was a moment of silence in which everyone present was aware of them. Bonnie met his gaze directly. "I am," she said. Eldrick Vane looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Orion. Then he looked back at her. "Remarkable," he said. And she could not tell if he meant her answer or something else entirely. The large 3rd man spoke for the first time. His voice was deep and slow, like stones shifting far underground. "You have been crying," he said to Bonnie, not unkindly, as a simple observation. "I have finished," she replied. The large man looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, as though she had passed some private measure he had applied without announcing it. Orion had watched the entire exchange without moving. Now he looked at Bonnie with an expression that was still difficult to read, but had something new in it. Something that had not been there at the beginning of the night when she had been invisible to every eye in that hall. Something that looked, in the cold moonlight, almost like recognition. "Come back inside," he said to her. She looked at him. "Why?" she asked. "Because the night is not finished," he said simply. "And neither are you." Bonnie looked at him for a long moment. The courtyard was cold, and the moon was still enormous overhead, and somewhere inside the castle the feast had begun in earnest. She could hear the low rumble of it through the stone walls, laughter and music, and the kind of noise that large celebrations make when the formalities are finished, and people begin to remember how to be human, or wolf, or whatever combination of both they carried in their blood on any given night. She thought about saying no. She thought about telling the Alpha King of the 7 territories that she was grateful for the conversation, and wished him a pleasant feast, and intended to find Petra and leave Veldrath Castle before the 2nd hour of the night, because she had nothing left to do here, and no remaining reason to subject herself to a hall full of people who had watched Cedric Caldwell look through her like glass. She thought about all of that. Then she looked at Orion's face, at the complete absence of pressure in it. The way he had said "come back inside" as an invitation and not a command, which she suspected was not the way he issued most of his instructions. And she made a decision that she knew even in the moment was not entirely rational. "Very well," she said. Petra, who had been standing slightly behind Bonnie's left shoulder with the expression of someone watching a situation develop well beyond anything she had prepared for, exhaled slowly. Cassian fell into step beside Petra with the easy confidence of a man who assumed his company was welcome and was usually correct. Eldrick Vane drifted ahead, his pale hair catching the moonlight, already appearing to lose interest in the group, in favor of whatever thought had replaced it. The large third man, whose name Bonnie still did not know, walked behind with the silent steadiness of someone who had assigned himself a post and intended to keep it. Orion walked beside Bonnie, not in front, not slightly ahead in the way that men with authority often position themselves, as though the space before them belongs to them, and others follow in their wake. Beside her, at a distance that was respectful and deliberate, matching her pace exactly. She noticed. She said nothing about it. They entered the castle through the side corridor, and the warmth hit her immediately after the cold of the courtyard, along with the full force of the feast's noise and scent. The corridor was narrow and lit by wall-mounted torches that cast everything in amber, and for a moment, walking through that warm tunnel of light with the sound of the celebration ahead, Bonnie felt something shift inside her that she could not immediately name. Not happiness. Not yet. Something quieter than that. Something that felt like the very first loosening of a knot that had been pulled tight for a very long time. They emerged into the great hall through a side entrance near the western fireplace, and the effect was immediate. It was not an entrance anyone could have planned. It simply happened the way things happen when the right combination of people moves through a door at the right moment. Orion stepped through first, and the nearest cluster of lords registered his presence within seconds, heads turning in that instinctive way that presence commands. And then the turning spread outward through the hall in a slow wave, table by table. The way a stone dropped in still water sends rings to every edge. And Bonnie walked beside him. She was aware of the eyes. She would have had to be insensible not to be. She kept her spine straight, and her chin at a level that she had learned from her mother. Not high enough to look arrogant, not low enough to look ashamed. The precise angle of someone who knows exactly where she stands and has decided that is enough. She felt the moment Cedric Caldwell saw her. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She felt it the way you feel a change in the air before a storm, a subtle shift in the quality of the room's attention that located itself, when she finally allowed her gaze to drift in that direction, in the green eyes that were fixed on her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Confusion. and something underneath the confusion that was less comfortable to name. Seraphine Ashford was seated beside him, composed and appropriate, and wearing a dress that had clearly been made by someone other than herself. She was looking at Bonnie too, though her expression was more carefully controlled. Bonnie looked away from both of them. Orion guided her, without touching her, toward the high table at the far end of the hall. It was done through presence alone, through the natural direction of his movement, and she followed it without entirely deciding to. The high table was elevated slightly above the rest of the hall on a low stone dais, and it was where the most significant guests of the gathering sat. Lord Veldrath was there, and 2 members of the High Pack Council, and several territorial lords whose names Bonnie knew from reputation, but had never expected to sit near. Lord Veldrath rose when he saw Orion approaching, with the automatic deference of a man who had been doing it for years. "My Lord King," he said. And then his eyes found Bonnie, and there was a brief recalibration in his expression, that he managed with the skill of a man who had been navigating political situations for decades. "And your guest?" "Lady Bonnie," Orion said, and the title landed in the air with a composure that left no room for question. Bonnie did not correct him. She was not a lady. She had no title, no land, no pack name to justify one. But something in the way he said it, without hesitation, without the slight upward inflection that would have made it a question or a courtesy rather than a statement, made the word feel less like a gift and more like a correction of something that had always been wrong. She took the seat that was offered to her. The feast continued around her, and the world reorganized itself. Cassian appeared on her left within a few minutes, having apparently rerouted from wherever he had been heading, with a cheerfulness that suggested detours were his natural state. "How are you finding the evening?" he asked, and the question was delivered with such perfect awareness of its own absurdity, given everything that had happened in the last hour, that it functioned as a kind of humor. "Surprising," Bonnie said. "That is one word," Cassian agreed. He reached for the wine carafe and refilled her goblet without being asked, which she noted was a gesture of familiarity that most men of his rank would not have extended to a woman they had met 20 minutes ago. Veldrath gatherings tend toward the dramatic. Something in the stone walls, I think, encourages poor decisions. "Some people's poor decisions," Bonnie said. "Indeed," Cassian said, and his eyes moved briefly toward the Caldwell table and back. "Some more consequential than others." Eldrick Vane appeared across the table and dropped into a seat with the boneless ease of a man who sat wherever he chose and expected the furniture to accommodate him. "You are not what I expected," he said to Bonnie, apparently continuing a conversation that had existed only in his own head. "You did not know I existed before tonight," she replied. "Exactly," he said, as though this proved his point. She looked at him. "What did you expect?" she asked, because she found she genuinely wanted to know. "Someone frightened," he said, with the directness that was clearly his default register. "Someone who would spend the evening trying to understand what was happening and say very little and look at the floor too often." He tilted his head. "You are not doing any of those things." "I spent 2 years being patient and quiet and hoping that was enough," Bonnie said. "It was not a productive strategy." Eldrick Vane smiled. It changed his face considerably, made it younger and warmer, and she understood that the permanent dry amusement was a kind of armor that he wore the way she wore fine, and the smile was what was underneath it. "No," he said. "It rarely is." Orion had been drawn into a conversation with Lord Veldrath and one of the council members, a conversation that had the quality of something that had been waiting to happen, and had seized the first available moment. He had not spoken to Bonnie since they sat down. But she was aware of him in the particular way. You are aware of something that is generating heat in a cold room, not looking at it, but knowing exactly where it is. Once, when Cassian said something that made her laugh, a real laugh, shorter and more surprised than she intended, she felt Orion's attention shift in her direction for a moment, before returning to the council member. She did not look at him, but she felt it. Then Cedric came. She heard him before she saw him, because she recognized the particular rhythm of his footsteps from 2 years of listening for them, and her spine straightened automatically, in a way she resented the moment she noticed it. He stopped a few paces from the high table with the expression of a man who had rehearsed what he intended to say, and was less certain of it now that he was here. Cassian went very still beside her, not tensely. The stillness of someone who has shifted from social mode to something more attentive. "Bonnie," Cedric said. She turned to look at him. She kept her face entirely neutral, which cost her something but not as much as it would have cost her 2 hours ago. "Cedric," she replied. He glanced at the high table, at the company she was sitting in, and she watched him absorb it. She watched him recalibrate. She watched the sequence of realizations move through his expression in the order they arrived. Surprise, then confusion, then something that was the beginning of understanding, and underneath all of it, the first faint shadow of a recognition that arrived too late. "I wanted to explain," he said. "You do not need to," she said. "The alliance with Ashford, it was my father's arrangement. It was not." "Cedric," she said, and her voice was quiet and even, and carried a finality that stopped him mid-sentence. "I understand. Family arrangements are what they are. I wish you well in your bond." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had no interest in interpreting. "You look—" he started. "Thank you for coming to speak with me," she said, with a courtesy that was genuine and complete, and also, unmistakably, a closing. He stood there for another moment. Then he nodded, once, and turned and walked back toward the Caldwell table. And she watched him go with a feeling that was quieter and cleaner than she expected, like setting down something heavy that she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it had weight. Cassian let out a slow breath beside her. "Well handled," he said quietly. "I have had practice," she replied. She reached for her wine goblet and found it already refilled. And when she looked to her right, Orion had returned his attention to the table, the council conversation apparently concluded, and he was looking at her with those dark, unhurried eyes, and she had the distinct impression that he had watched the entire exchange with Cedric without appearing to. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question was low, meant for her. She considered it honestly. "Yes," she said. And this time, for the first time tonight, the word "fine" was nowhere in it. "I think I actually am." Something in his expression shifted, barely perceptible. But she was learning to read the small movements in a face that kept most of itself very still, and what she saw there was not pity and was not satisfaction. It was something much simpler than either of those things. It looked like relief. The feast ran long into the night. Candles burned down to their bases in the iron holders along the tables, and the torches on the walls dimmed to a deeper amber, and the noise of the hall softened gradually from celebration into the quieter, warmer register of people who had eaten well and drunk moderately, and found themselves in no particular hurry to leave. Lords who had arrived in full political performance had loosened into something more human. Servants moved between the tables collecting empty platters. Somewhere near the eastern fireplace, a pair of musicians had replaced the earlier ensemble, and were playing something slow and unhurried that floated above the conversation without demanding attention. Bonnie had stopped tracking time somewhere between the second goblet of wine and the moment Eldrick Vane had made her laugh so unexpectedly that she had nearly upset her plate. She had eaten. She had spoken. She had listened to Cassian describe a territorial dispute in the western reaches with such theatrical embellishment that even the council member beside Lord Veldrath had abandoned his diplomatic composure and smiled. She had answered Petra's increasingly wide eyes with small, reassuring looks across the table that communicated, "I will explain everything later," with the efficiency of two women who had known each other long enough to hold entire conversations without words. And through all of it, Orion had been beside her. Not performing beside her, not displaying her. Simply present. In that way, that seemed to require no effort, and produced more effect than most men achieved with considerable effort. He had spoken to her in the spaces between other conversations, unhurried, asking questions that were not the questions powerful men usually asked women they had just met. Not about her pack or her family name or her prospects, but about the embroidery on her dress, about whether she had learned from her mother, about what the cedar chest had held besides the silk thread. She had answered honestly, which surprised her each time she did it. She had told him about the chest, about the lavender, about her mother's hands that had been rough from work, but precise when they needed to be. She had told him that her mother had taught her that the quality of a stitch mattered even when no one would look closely enough to see it. Because you would know, and the things you build with care carry that care inside them whether anyone else notices or not. Orion had listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished he had been quiet for a moment and then said simply, "She was right. 2 words." And yet they had settled somewhere inside her with a weight that a great deal of more elaborate praise would not have achieved. Now the hall was thinning. Lords were rising from their tables, exchanging final words, calling for their escorts. The Caldwell table had emptied some time ago, and Bonnie had noticed Cedric's departure only as an absence, the way you notice a draft has stopped, not with relief exactly, but with the mild surprise of realizing you had forgotten to keep tracking it. Petra appeared at Bonnie's shoulder. "The Wren party is preparing to leave," she said quietly, meaning the group she had traveled with, the ferryman's contingent from their village who had attached themselves to the Wren pack's escort for the journey. "If we do not go with them tonight, we will have no escort back." Bonnie nodded. She had known this moment was coming. She turned to Orion. He was already looking at her, which had stopped surprising her sometime in the last 2 hours. "I need to go," she said. "I know," he replied. "The escort I traveled with is leaving. I know that too," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him more carefully. "Orion," she said. "There is something I want to say to you before you leave," he said. "If you will hear it." She looked at him steadily. "I will hear it." He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was choosing words with the same care she used to choose stitches, not for speed, but for accuracy. "I came to Veldrath tonight because the gathering required my presence," he said. "I have attended 17 of these gatherings. They have been, without exception, exactly what I expected them to be." He paused. "Tonight was not what I expected." "Nor for me," she said. "What happened to you in this hall tonight was unjust," he said, and the words were flat and certain, the way he said everything that he meant fully. "Not only Caldwell. The entire architecture of it. The system that puts a woman in a silver dress she made with her own hands in a side corridor because she has no pack name, while men with inherited titles declare choices that have more to do with land than with anything worth choosing." He stopped. "That is unjust, and I am sorry you were subjected to it." Bonnie looked at him for a long moment. "You are the Alpha King," she said quietly. "You built some of that architecture." "I know," he said, without flinching. "That is part of why I am saying it." She held his gaze. There was no deflection in it, no political smoothing, no performance of humility that was actually a request for absolution. He simply looked back at her and let the words be what they were. She exhaled slowly. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it." He nodded once. "I would like to see you again," he said, "not as a courtesy, not as a consequence of tonight. I would like to see you again because I find that I want to, and I have learned not to ignore the things I find I want, because they are rarer than people assume. The hall was quieter now. Most of the remaining guests absorbed in their own departures, and the musicians near the fireplace were playing something so soft it was almost below hearing. The torches had burned down further, and the light was warmer and lower. And Bonnie was aware that this moment had a specific quality to it that she would remember with precision for a very long time. "I live in the village of Caldenmore," she said. 3 days' ride north of the Wren territory border. There is one inn, and a market that runs on 7th days, and a blacksmith who is Petra's father and knows everything that happens within a 10-mile radius before it happens. Something shifted at the corner of Orion's mouth. "That sounds like a place that would be difficult to visit without being noticed," he said. "Extremely," she agreed. "Good," he said. "I prefer things that require some navigation." She looked at him for another moment. Then she did something she had not planned, and did not entirely understand until she was already doing it. She reached out and placed her hand briefly over his where it rested on the table. Not grasping, not clinging, just a moment of contact, clean and deliberate. The way she made stitches, with care and intention, and the knowledge that even if no one else would look closely enough to see it, she would know. His hand turned slightly beneath hers. Just enough. She withdrew her hand. She stood. She smoothed the silver dress with its oak branch embroidery, and its silk thread that had bled her fingers, and its 3 weeks of candlelit evenings that had been built toward a different ending entirely, and had somehow arrived at this one. "Good night, Orion," she said. "Good night, Bonnie," he replied. She walked away from the high table with Petra at her side, and she did not look back. Not because she was not tempted, but because she was. And she had learned something tonight about the difference between the things you reach for out of fear and the things you leave space for out of certainty. Petra gripped her arm the moment they reached the corridor. "You are going to tell me everything," she whispered fiercely. "Every single word, starting from the fountain." "Starting from the fountain," Bonnie agreed. They rode out of Veldrath with the Wren escort in the deep hours before dawn, when the sky was still dark, but the quality of the darkness had shifted, thinning at the edges in the way it does before color returns to the world. The forest road was quiet, and the horses moved steadily through it, and Bonnie rode with the silver dress bundled carefully across her saddlebag, because she had changed into her traveling clothes, but could not bring herself to fold it carelessly. She would take the embroidery out, she decided. The oak branches. She would use the silver thread for something else, something that had nothing to do with the Caldwell Pack's heraldry, something that was only hers. Petra rode beside her and talked, as Petra always did, filling the silence with observations and questions and periodic exclamations of disbelief. And Bonnie answered and listened, and let herself be carried along by the familiar comfort of her friend's voice in the dark. 3 weeks later, a messenger arrived in Caldenmore. Petra's father, the blacksmith, saw him coming down the north road before anyone else, and had already set down his hammer and walked to the door of his forge by the time the rider reached the village center. The messenger wore no pack colors, just a dark riding cloak and a leather satchel, and he asked for Bonnie by name with an accuracy that suggested he had been given precise directions. Bonnie was in the market when Petra found her. The letter was sealed with plain wax. No insignia pressed into it, which told her something about the sender's preference for discretion. Inside, the handwriting was precise and unhurried, each letter formed with the same quality of deliberate care she had come to recognize in everything he did. It said, "I navigated the blacksmith. He is formidable. I have been informed of the 7th day market, the inn's best room, and the precise history of every family within a 10-mile radius. I will arrive on the 14th day if that is acceptable to you. If it is not, send word, and I will wait." Oh. Bonnie read it twice. Then she looked up at Petra, who was watching her with an expression of barely contained anticipation that had been building for 3 weeks. "Well?" Petra demanded. Bonnie folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her coat, against her chest, where the coal of a different kind of promise had once lived and burned out. This one felt different from the first moment. Not like a coal. Not like something she was tending carefully in case the wind changed. More like the kind of warmth that comes from a fire built properly, with the right wood, in a sheltered place, by someone who knows what they are doing and intends to stay. "Tell your father to expect a guest," Bonnie said. On the 14th, Petra made a sound that was equal parts joy and triumph, and the market went on around them, and the seventh-day crowd moved between the stalls, and the blacksmith's hammer resumed its rhythm in the forge, and life in Caldenmore continued exactly as it always had, ordinary and unhurried and real. Except that Bonnie was smiling, and this time, she was not pretending. On the 14th day, Orion came. He rode in without ceremony, without guard, without the weight of title visibly attached to him. Just a tall man on a dark horse who had navigated Petra's father and the North Road and the 10-mile radius of everything that had ever happened within it. He found Bonnie at the market because that is where she was, and he walked toward her, through the ordinary crowd of an ordinary seventh day, with the same unhurried certainty with which he did everything. And when he reached her, he simply looked at her, the way he had looked at her in the moonlit courtyard, as though she were something he had recognized before he had the words for it. "You came," she said. "I said I would," he replied. She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "That is why I believed you." They stood in the middle of the Caldenmore market, while the world went about its business around them. And it was not a grand hall, or a moonlit courtyard, or a high table with lords in attendance. It was just a village and a morning, and two people who had met in an unexpected place, and told each other the truth, and decided, each in their own way, that truth was worth returning to. In the months that followed, Orion returned to Caldenmore again and again, each time staying longer, each time with the easy rhythm of someone who was not visiting, but arriving. The village grew accustomed to him. Petra's father declared him adequate after the third visit, which Petra said was the highest praise her father had ever extended to anyone. The inn's best room became simply his room. The seventh-day market became a fixed point in his calendar. And Bonnie, who had once stood at a stone fountain in a silver dress and told the moon she would not wait for anyone ever again, discovered that there was a difference between waiting and choosing, and that she had never been doing the former. She had simply been waiting for the right person to make the choosing feel like something other than surrender. By the first snow of the following winter, the bond between them was known across all 7 territories, spoken of in the High Pack Council and in the halls of every lord who had attended the Veldrath gathering, including the Caldwell table, where Cedric sat with his Ashford alliance and his inherited debts, and the particular private weight of a man who understood, too late and too clearly, exactly what he had looked away from on the night that mattered. Seraphine Ashford was a perfectly adequate bondmate. Cedric was a perfectly adequate alpha. They built a perfectly adequate life together, and it was precisely what he had chosen, and he lived in it with the knowledge that adequate had been his own decision. Bonnie stood at the window of the inn on the morning of the first snow and watched it fall over the rooftops of Caldenmore and felt the warmth of the fire behind her and the letter she had just written on the table. A letter to Orion, who was 3 days' ride south on council business and would be back before the week was out, because he always came back, because he said he would, because that was the kind of man he was. She pressed one hand briefly against the cold glass. Then she turned away from the window, back toward the fire, back toward the room that smelled of cedar and warmth and the particular ordinary miracle of a life that had been built carefully, stitch by stitch, with thread that had cost something to use. The cedar chest sat in the corner. Inside it, folded with care, was the silver dress. She would wear it again, she had decided, not for anyone's choosing ceremony. Not as a hope she was carrying on behalf of someone else's promise. She would wear it on a day that was entirely hers. She already knew which day that would be.